was not allowed to have any boyfriends growing up. You had to make sure you lived by the Bible. If you didn't, it was a sin.
The reason Mandy married Paul so quick was because they were trying to do things right. She seemed happy, and that made me happy.
At first, Paul seemed like a good man, but the trouble was, she knew nothing of him.
The folks who are quiet, those are the folks that you may least expect, but who could prove to be the most dangerous.
I just want you to tell me what happened.
You know what happened.
This case is one that involves an act of evil.
They're gonna take her side over me, no matter what.
It was a tragedy. It broke our whole family.
I would have liked to have ripped his head off and fed it to my pigs.
I'm gonna be betrayed as a monster.
Mandy was really outgoing. She was an amazing person. She taught me how to ride bikes, and we played dolls and went on trips to Tennessee.
Mandy was very quirky. She was always being funny, being more silly than funny. You know what I mean? She always tried to make you laugh. That was how she came across. She had a real personality. My grandfather was a pastor of our local church. We went to church. It was like Wednesday night Bible study, Saturday night, choir practice, Sunday morning service, night service. So that was a big part of our weeks. This is Mandy's baptizing photo. She was like 15 or 16 there.
Make sure you lived by the Bible. If you didn't, it was a sin.
Paul LeMay met Mandy online. They met on Facebook. Paul LeMay came down to Eastern Kentucky by way of Massachusetts. I think Paul was very smitten by Mandy. I think he was very attracted to the idea that a woman so far away wanted him, and that's what precipitated his relocation to Eastern Kentucky.
The trouble was, she knew nothing of him.
Paul was older. He was 47 or 48. He'd already lived life, so in her mind, she thought he was smarter about things.
Mandy liked that he was different, not from around here. Paul would come every other weekend to come take her to church.
Paul was portrayed to me as a religious person and a good guy. He was this big Christian guy who was really nice. I was happy for her. She had said that they had things in common, that they could actually talk to each other for a long time. She seemed happy, and that made me happy.
They dated about 7 months at the most. And then they got married.
From what she had told me, the reason she married Paul so quick was because they were trying to do things right. It was just a little small wedding, just a few people from that church that they went to.
It was a 15-minute ceremony. It wasn't nothing fancy. My grandparents thought it was a good thing, too, to get married to Paul. They liked that he had a job, could provide for her, and had 2 vehicles.
Paul didn't have much family nearby. None of his family was there, I know that. Looking back, it was very weird to me. I've personally never met none of Paul's family.
Paul LeMay has this mysterious past where we don't know a lot about his background, and that may be by design. It's possible that he doesn't want Mandy or her family or anybody to know a lot about him. It's interesting because we have someone who, on one hand, has estranged or distant relationships from family members, but on the other hand, has an identified loved one that they've idolized. It sets itself up for problems in the future.
Paul and Mandy lived in Oil Springs, Sayersville, Kentucky. It's a little town, a back road. Paul, he worked at a nursing home, and he brought home the money.
He paid for the home that they lived in.
She didn't have to work at all, Mandy didn't. He made sure she had everything she needed, didn't let her go without. At first, Paul seemed like a good man, from what I seen anyway.
But sometimes Paul would say a lot of negative things on Facebook. That may have been his way to get his point across, was through social media. Say the things on there that he couldn't say in person. It's a Facebook post from Paul. All my life I've been called no good, that I'm worthless, that I will never amount to anything. I finally had enough and I came here to Kentucky, where I've got myself a home that I paid for. I have a beautiful loving wife, and anyone says otherwise, they are a liar. He was very fragile. I could see that. He never opened up, wouldn't talk. Maybe there was a reason behind it. There was a madness in his old life that I didn't know about.
Paul LeMay's Facebook posts say to me that this is someone who's vulnerable and identifies with this role of someone who's been victimized and has to take on the world.
At the time, me and my husband had separated. My children were tiny. Mandy, she's like, if you want to, you can come here, you can stay with me and Paul. She's like, we can spend time together, get back to being sisters. And so in my mind, it was an awesome idea because I loved Mandy. She was my best friend.
Mandy, she loved her hair dye. She started dyeing her hair crazy colors. It was blue, purple, and one time she messed it up and it was half blonde and half blue.
One time we were gonna dye both of our hair that same night. And we was gonna go out and get the hair dyed. And Paul wouldn't allow us to do it. Paul, it wasn't a necessary thing, so she wasn't allowed to do it.
Why was that?
I don't know why he wouldn't allow her to do it. I'm trying to answer these for you, but I can't find a rhyme to the reason of why he wouldn't let her. I suppose he treated her like a child.
The fact that Paul LeMay's relationship with Mandy appears to be more like that of a father and a daughter, is indicative of his controlling nature. It's also interesting that in this day and age, where social media and videos of one another are very common, that there's actually very little of that with Paul, LeMay, and Mandy. If he can control the little day-to-day tasks that she does, he can ultimately control her life.
Paul would work and he would come home and I would say, "Hi, Paul." He would say, "Hello." And that would, that was it. He would always lock himself in his bedroom.
The folks who are quiet and brooding and kind of seething underneath, those are the folks that you may least expect, but who could prove to be the most dangerous.
He would always lock himself in his bedroom. I thought it was weird. He wouldn't associate with the rest of us. Nobody really knew what was going on in there. Paul could be quiet, Paul could be shy. Behind closed doors, Paul could be a creep. He would lock himself in there like a hermit crab. One time she had opened the door and asked him what he wanted for supper, and he told her, "I don't care what we have for supper. I don't care if we effing eat or not." In my mind, she was trying to take care of him and do what a wife should be doing for a husband. And he was straight up disrespectful to her.
This is Mandy at a rough time. About 25, probably. This looks like the time she had gotten arguments with Paul.
A lot of the times they would argue. They would argue in the bedroom, in their room. And we tried to stay away from that because I had kids and I didn't want them to hear that. So we always tried to stay out of the arguments. It was always behind that bedroom door. Mandy would go in her room, she would come back out and she'd be like, "Oh, it's happened again." Paul, he's in one of his moods.
But she chose to stay.
I don't know why she chose to stay, but I think a lot of it is that she was actually building a home and building a life. And it's just like, to her, it was nothing, like she'd grown used to it.
There's indication that the arguments between Paul and Mandy are escalating. It begs the question of, what's happening there. Is it that he feels he's losing control and his own insecurity is knocking at the door? When someone like Paul doesn't feel in control, he may lash out impulsively.
One day we was going up to see Mom, and we had made it from Sayersville to Prestonsburg, and we made it that far before he had called her on his break, and there was a heated argument to the point that she pulled over and we turned around and went back. Anytime Mandy had to do anything, she had to run it by Paul and make sure Paul was okay with it. He had come home from work and he said he wasn't feeling good, so he went in there and he laid down and went to sleep. And so me and Mandy and the kids had went out to Walmart. And he was so mad when we come back because she had left without saying something to him that she actually went into the room and wasn't allowed back. She didn't come back out that night.
Here's a situation where Paul is about 20 years older than Mandy, yet he has effectively grounded her. When individuals are that controlling and domineering, it makes you wonder what else is happening behind closed doors.
Felt like she was trapped in a prison. Mandy would say things like, "I feel like I'm in jail sometimes," Paul was very controlling. The last 2 or 3 months that I stayed there, we didn't really go anywhere or do anything. Pretty much the only thing he allowed Mandy to do was to do the grocery shopping.
He wouldn't let her go anywhere and do anything or see anyone. But when she stopped coming around, I knew something was up.
Several times I told Mandy that she didn't have to put up with that. She could leave, but she never would listen. It's like it was her relationship. I needed to butt out of it. It wasn't any of my business. Me and the kids would stay in that room on the opposite side from where her and Paul would stay. We just kept them back there unless they needed to come out and use the bathroom. It was like we were walking on eggshells, so to speak, tiptoeing around the house. I wish I would have stepped in and done something because I feel like I could have helped her out. And I wish I'd just let her know that I cared more, you know what I mean? I wish I got her out of there.
Paul is this quiet fella who keeps to himself. But as time goes on, his Facebook posts start to get more aggressive.
Last night was a tough night. I cried most of the night. The enemy wanting me to do something, but I was strong enough not to do it. Hopefully today is a better day. Now I kind of beat myself up for not putting them on my Facebook. I've never seen these. It just hurts me. I've not seen those.
From a religious perspective, Paul may be referring to the enemy as Satan. It's also possible that the enemy is his rage, his insecurity. This is an example of an individual who seems to be fighting to control their behavior.
This Facebook post is Paul is really trying to bury those demons and keep himself from crossing that line from verbal aggression to physical aggression.
Had I seen this at the time, I'd been angry. I'd tried to help her.
It begs the question, what kind of threats could Paul LeMay have been making behind closed doors? Regardless of which way we go, we're heading into the abyss. Things are about to get worse.
One day, one of the kids had climbed up on the table and had knocked over a couple of plates and cups that was sitting on the table from when they were eating. Paul, he didn't really explode or anything. He went into the room, he had hollered for Mandy to come in there, and I don't know what was happening to Mandy. Like I said, she was in that room, they were locked in there, I don't know. They were in there for over an hour, and when they came out, they had got a change or two of clothes for each one of them. And she told me that they'd be back. That's when Paul and Mandy had left there. I could tell something was wrong. Not often my sister calls me crying. She told me she was scared for him to be around the kids. If I didn't get the kids out of there before they got back, that something was gonna happen. He might hurt them or something.
There's increasing evidence that Paul LeMay is becoming unraveled. That's particularly worrisome because individuals who threaten or hurt children tend to lack remorse and empathy for others.
It did kind of scare me at that point. So the best thing for me to do for my kids was to leave. When I left there with the kids, things with Paul and Mandy got a lot worse.
The trouble was, Paul would act normal sometimes. Sometimes he didn't seem like a bad guy at all. He was nice, he was polite. To me, it was strange.
We're seeing this Jekyll and Hyde personality. We have someone who's, on one hand, saying, Mandy, I love you, my beautiful wife. And on the other hand, someone who is controlling her, potentially threatening children, not giving her money to go to the store. So we see these two diametrically opposed personality behaviors, and that's actually quite common in individuals who perpetrate interpersonal violence.
There was a couple months after I moved out, she was telling me that he was getting a lot more aggressive. She was telling me that Paul was starting to be more physical with her. Started out with him shoving her. And then it got to where he would get in her face and he would get more violent with her. She said she was scared that if she didn't get out of there, that she wouldn't get out of there. She called me and told me she did leave Paul. She was at a friend's house, that she was scared of him and that she didn't want to go back home. She told me they were good people, she was safe. I didn't really question it. She was out of the bad situation, so in my mind, she was good. And she told me she was going to come over for Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving is really important to our family because it's the only time we actually sit down around the table and gather around and pray over the food.
I was excited. I'm not gonna lie, it'd been months since I got to see my sister, so I was excited.
The family are ready to eat Thanksgiving dinner. Dinner comes and goes, but there's no Mandy.
Nobody could get a hold of her. Nobody knew exactly where she was. I was the last one to know where she was, and she was supposed to be at that friend's house.
As the minutes turned to hours, the hours turned to days, I could imagine a whole host of thoughts, running through their head about where Mandy might be. Maybe she's in the hospital. Maybe she's just out having a good time. Maybe Mandy's gone to see somebody else for Thanksgiving, and maybe she'll turn back up.
Couldn't believe what happened next. Mandy had told me she was at a friend's house and she was safe. But then we wasn't having no luck getting hold of her. I tried contacting her phone, her Facebook, her messenger, and she just would not answer. I didn't even know where to start to go to look. I had went out and I had printed off some photos to give the state police.
The uncertainty of it all was a very terrifying moment for that family, just not knowing. Despite the family's concern over Mandy being gone for 2 to 3 weeks, on December 17, there's a post on her Facebook account.
I needed to get away from the drama and drive myself out. I will contact the ones in my family after the first of the year.
I knew reading that day that wasn't Mandy.
I love you. Please understand I'm going through hard times right now, but I will contact you after the first. Love you later.
That's words of an alcoholic. Mandy wasn't an alcoholic and didn't have to dry herself out. Everything in this is spelled exactly as it should be, down to every last apostrophe and everything, and Mandy always spelled things very weird. Her spelling was never correct, and everything in this was right. And so, reading this when it came out, everybody knew something was wrong. Everybody knew that wasn't Mandy.
Homer then contacted Paul asking where Mandy was, what was going on. Homer asked him if it was them that posted that on there. Paul wouldn't speak back. Dad was mad trying to find his sister. After a while, Paul says, I ain't heard from her in weeks either. That's when Dad got mad and called the cops.
Dispatcher Thompson.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I was wondering, how do I go about filing a missing person report?
Okay, what's going on?
Okay, my sister, her and her husband had split up, and nobody has seen her since the day before Thanksgiving.
Who is your sister?
Mandy Ann King LeMay.
Okay, and what's your name?
Homer King.
Okay, and she's married?
Yes. He's telling us that he hasn't seen her since the day before Thanksgiving either.
Okay, I'll have a trooper make contact with you, okay?
Okay, I appreciate it.
Homer was really annoyed at Paul. He was wanting to know where Mandy was, but she ain't spoke to nobody in over 3 weeks.
We know from the evidence so far that Mandy has been controlled by Paul. And the family's probably thinking maybe it's just their relationship. It's very possible that Paul has Mandy trapped inside the house.
When the trooper arrives to Mandy and Paul's residence, he goes up onto the porch. The blinds are drawn, he can't see inside the residence. He hears a series of what he describes as thumps. It sounded like someone was moving around in the home, but nobody ever came to the door. So that trooper immediately radios for backup. Paul is in fact inside the residence and is not coming out of the residence. The Kentucky State Police show up very quickly. It has escalated into a barricaded subject who's refusing to come out and respond to law enforcement commands and who is known to own a .22 caliber handgun. They were concerned that Mandy was being held inside the residence. As the Kentucky State Police are trying to get Paul LeMay to cooperate with their commands, they're looking for folks, neighbors, who might have any means to contact Paul. One of the neighbors happens to have Paul LeMay on Facebook Messenger. And Paul responds. Paul's still refusing to come out of the residence. But as the time goes on, Paul wants a cigarette. The Kentucky State Police tell Paul, "You've got to come to us." Paul is very reluctant to do this. So the neighbor, Pat, volunteers to take the cigarette to Paul, who's standing on the porch. Now, at this time, when Paul comes out of the residence, Paul LeMay is dressed in nothing but sweatpants and no shirt. It's December 17 in Kentucky. It's very cold, so the next door neighbor, Pat, also offers his sweatshirt. As soon as Paul LeMay gets that sweatshirt, he is rushed by two troopers who are laying in wait, and that's how the Kentucky State Police eventually got Paul into custody. The state police begin a sweep of the LeMay residence to look for Mandy. At that point, they had no idea whether she was dead or alive. When the troopers walked into the LeMay residence, they were met by the smell of death. They could smell decomposition in the air. When they get into this back bedroom, they can make out a pile of blankets, and sticking out from the bottom of that blanket is what is obviously a human foot. They pull the sheets back, and there they find the deceased body of Mandy LeMay. She had a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. What's clear, at this point, she had been there for quite some time.
I got a call from Daddy. He said, she's gone. She won't be coming back. I fell to the floor. My whole body was paralyzed for 3 days after that.
I never knew she went back there to even think that could have happened. I'm done. That's as far as I want to go.
A family in Johnson County is wishing they would have seen the signs after police say their family member, Mandy LeMay, was shot and killed by her husband.
Paul LeMay's statements to Kentucky State Police during his recorded interview tells us that Paul was obviously in a very troubled place.
I just want you to tell me what happened.
You know what happened. You want me to come out and say it? I'll say it. Yes, I killed her. I didn't want to. I loved the woman, damn it.
My guess is that Paul did it so that nobody else could have her, and she couldn't leave him.
It's gonna come out that I'm the bad guy no matter what. They're gonna take her side over me.
Paul clearly identifies as the victim. Individuals who fail to take responsibility for their own actions are some of the same individuals who are callous and lack empathy and remorse.
She would have been alive now if she wouldn't have went back. But Mandy couldn't make up her mind whether she loved him or not.
I'm gonna be betrayed as a monster.
You want to tell me how you done it?
We learned through the course of the investigation, Mandy had left the marital residence and hadn't returned for quite some time. but eventually, Mandy LeMay returns home.
I just sat on the couch looking at her.
She tells Paul that she's lost her telephone. She doesn't have one, and she needs a mean of communications. She wants to be able to reach out to her family and set up this plan to go spend Thanksgiving with her family, to have dinner with them.
She wanted to use a phone. She was talking to someone.
We know that Paul LeMay is in the house at that time, and he is likely hearing these conversations take place. He understands that in a few more days, when Thanksgiving rolls around, Mandy's going to be back out the door again, spending time with her family, and eventually an argument between the two ensues.
At this point, Paul knows that he's lost Mandy. He's lost control of the one person in his life, the source of his ego. And now we can see that the dark impulses are going to seep back in. It's almost like a volcano erupting. This is the last straw.
What little bit of heart I had left for her, it just went away.
The evidence in this case shows that Paul LeMay went to his bedroom.
What kind of gun was it, Paul?
A 22 revolver.
He took that revolver into the living room. He put that gun to the back of Mandy LeMay's head, and he pulled that trigger.
Well, from what I was told, he shot her in the back bedroom and dragged her to their bed, and he slept next to her those several weeks that she was laying there.
In the very end, after she died, Paul still didn't want to let her go. This is indicative of yet another final opportunity for him to control her.
I reckon Paul was trying to preserve the body because he literally slept in a freezing house next to her. So y'all had the funeral? It's hard for me to walk through the funeral doors. I walked out when I seen the casket and it was closed. I didn't even get to tell her goodbye.
I could have got Mandy out. Mandy could have been safe. Mandy could be here with us now.
It would have been nice if Mandy could have met my children more. I could explain to them better of how good of a person she was. How good of an aunt she would have been, how much they would have been spoiled. It hurts me every day that she can't be here with us today.
Paul was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists, both of whom cleared him as competent to stand trial.
You swear the testimony about to give is the truth, whole truth, and nothing but truth, so help you God?
Yeah, I do.
Your name?
Paul LeMay.
Grand jury charges that on or about November 20, 2018, you committed the death of Mandy LeMay by shooting her in the head which caused her death, that being the charge of murder. You wish to enter into a guilty plea based on the Commonwealth's offer on plea of guilt?
Yes.
If I accept your plea,
Paul LeMay didn't actually go to trial. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder, 1 count of abuse of a corpse.
Judge, on behalf of Mr. LeMay, he declines to make a statement other than to say that the truth that he would tell wouldn't be believed by anyone.
It's still very frustrating that he couldn't explain to everybody in court why he did do it.
And that's all he wanted me to say on his behalf.
And so He thought he didn't have to give his explanation. He didn't have to tell a why.
Okay. All right. So taking on back.
That's what makes me lose sleep at night. Because I'll never know why. I'll never know why it happened. I'll never know.
There's likely several reasons why Paul ended up murdering Mandy. Paul wanted control from the very beginning, and he had it until the very end.
She was an amazing person.
Mandy would want to be remembered as the funny, goofy, outgoing, people-friendly person that she was. I like to think I'm going to see her again. That's what keeps me going every day. We'll see our loved ones again.
The call comes in just after midnight, not urgent, not dramatic, just another voice over the radio cutting through the humid Florida night, a routine traffic stop on a two-lane road where the streetlights flicker and the insects scream louder than the engines, a sedan pulled over for a broken taillight, the kind of stop officers forget the moment their shift ends, except this one doesn't end, not really, because 20 years later, investigators will still be replaying that moment in their heads, asking how something so ordinary could be tied to a cold case that never stopped breathing. In the summer of 2001, Florida was heavy with heat and secrets, the air thick, the kind that sticks to your skin and refuses to let go, and in the small coastal community of Palm Ridge, people didn't lock their doors, they waved at passing cars, they believed bad things happened somewhere else, on the news, in cities with names that sounded far away, until one night, a young woman vanished without a sound, without a struggle, without a single witness willing to say they saw anything at all. Her name was Emily Carter, 24 years old, waitress, part-time student, the kind of face you see every day and never expect to end up on a missing poster. She worked the late shift at a roadside diner just off Highway 17, clocked out at 11:43 p.m., told her coworker she'd see her tomorrow, stepped into the parking lot under a buzzing fluorescent light, and then she was gone, no scream, no blood, no abandoned car, just absence, sudden and absolute. By morning, her mother was calling the diner, her phone going straight to voicemail, the manager insisting Emily had left alone, the parking lot empty when police arrived, the asphalt still warm from the night before, tire marks layered over tire marks, impossible to separate the important from the irrelevant, and within hours, the word missing was replaced with something colder, something heavier, something that settled into the pit of the community's stomach like a stone. The headlines came fast: local woman vanishes after late shift, search underway, community on edge, and for a moment, everyone was looking, volunteers with flashlights combing the tree line, deputies knocking on doors, helicopters chopping the sky, but days passed, then weeks, and the trail went cold in the way investigators dread most, not with a dramatic dead end, but with nothing at all, no suspects, no ransom note, no body, just a life erased between one breath and the next. They called it a cold case by the end of the year, a label that sounds clinical, almost gentle, but in reality means unanswered questions stacked on top of each other until they start to rot. And in Palm Ridge, the name Emily Carter became shorthand for fear, parents walking their daughters to their cars, locks appearing on doors that had been open for decades, every unfamiliar vehicle suddenly suspicious. Detectives worked what they had, which wasn't much: a few grainy security tapes from nearby businesses showing nothing more than passing headlights, a handful of tips that led nowhere, an ex-boyfriend with an alibi that checked out, a drifter questioned and released, rumors that spread faster than facts, and then, slowly, the phone stopped ringing, the search parties dissolved, and Emily's face faded from the evening news. Years slipped by, the diner changed owners, the parking lot was repaved, and life in Palm Ridge resumed its careful version of normal, but the case file never closed. It sat on a metal shelf in evidence, gathering dust, waiting, and the detectives who had worked it aged, retired, moved on, leaving behind a mystery that felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-word. Then, 2 decades later, on a night that looked exactly like any other, a patrol officer noticed a flicker of red where there shouldn't be one, a taillight out, a minor violation, the kind that barely registers. He hit the lights, the sedan pulled over without hesitation, and for a few minutes, nothing about the stop suggested history was about to resurface. The driver was calm, cooperative, handed over his license with steady hands, said he hadn't realized the light was broken, a story told 1,000 times a night on Florida roads, but something about the name on that license tugged at the officer's memory, not enough to alarm him, just enough to slow him down, to run the name twice, to linger a moment longer than protocol required. The database took its time, the cursor blinking, the radio crackling, and then the screen filled with a notification that shouldn't have been there, a flag tied to an investigation long buried, a missing person from 2001, a name that hadn't been spoken in roll call for years, Emily Carter, and suddenly the night felt different, heavier, as if the air itself remembered. Backup was called, casually at first, then with more urgency, the driver asked to step out of the vehicle, his expression tightening just slightly, not panic, not guilt, just the smallest fracture in the mask, the kind only seasoned officers notice, and when they searched the trunk, they didn't find a body, they didn't find blood, they found something else, something that made one of them swear under his breath, a personal item logged into evidence 2 decades earlier and never recovered. From that moment on, the cold case wasn't cold anymore. Phones rang in offices that hadn't heard Emily's name in years, retired detectives were contacted at home, boxes pulled from storage, dust shaken off reports written by men who had since grown gray, and as the story leaked, the headlines returned, sharper this time, Florida 2001 cold case reopened, routine traffic stop shocks investigators, a community jolted awake by a past it thought had finally settled. But reopening a case doesn't mean solving it, and as investigators dug back into the timeline, they found the same gaps, the same unanswered questions, now complicated by time, by lost witnesses, by memories that had warped or vanished entirely, and the man from the traffic stop, suddenly at the center of it all, insisted he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance, claimed coincidence, claimed ignorance, claimed the past had nothing to say about the present. Yet coincidence has a way of stacking up until it collapses under its own weight, and in Palm Ridge, people began to talk again, whispers moving from porch to porch, old rumors resurfacing, a neighbor remembering a scream they once dismissed as nothing, a co-worker recalling a car idling too long in the diner lot, details that seemed insignificant at the time now taking on a darker shape. For Emily's family, the reopening was both hope and torture, the phone ringing late at night, detectives asking them to relive the worst days of their lives, to answer the same questions they had answered 20 years earlier, to look again at photos they had tried so hard to forget, and in their living room, time seemed to fold in on itself, the past bleeding into the present. The case file grew thicker, not thinner, every new lead opening 3 more questions, and as investigators pushed forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever happened to Emily Carter didn't end the night she vanished, it lingered, it waited, it followed a man down dark Florida roads until a broken taillight finally forced it into the light, and even then, it refused to give up its secrets easily. Because some cold cases don't stay buried, they breathe, they shift, they wait for the smallest crack in the surface, a routine stop, a flicker of red in the dark, and when they come back, they don't just ask to be solved, they demand to be remembered. The evidence bag sat on the metal table under harsh fluorescent lights, sealed, labeled, untouched for years until tonight, a single object that should never have been there, a relic from a life that vanished in 2001, and every investigator in the room understood the weight of it before anyone said a word, because this was not a coincidence you could explain away, not something that wandered into the wrong trunk by accident, it was a ghost that had waited 20 years to be found. They moved carefully now, voices low, movements deliberate, the driver from the traffic stop seated in an interview room down the hall, his rights read, his phone confiscated, his story already beginning to shift at the edges, small changes, subtle rewrites, the kind that don't scream guilt but whisper discomfort, and in another room, detectives reopened the old file, page by page, timeline by timeline, as if tracing the outline of a wound that had never healed. Emily Carter's last day unfolded again on paper, familiar but newly sharp, her morning class at the community college, her shift at the diner, the regular customers who remembered her smile, the cook who remembered nothing unusual, the parking lot that swallowed her whole, and now, added to the margins, a name that had never been there before, a man who lived 3 counties away in 2001, who owned a dark sedan, who worked irregular hours, who had no documented connection to Emily at all, except for the object in his trunk that tied him to her disappearance like a knot pulled too tight to undo. The first interviews were cautious, almost polite, detectives circling rather than striking, letting him talk, letting him fill the silence with explanations that sounded reasonable if you didn't listen too closely. He said he'd bought the car secondhand, said he didn't know how the item got there, said he had no memory of Palm Ridge, no memory of Emily Carter, and every sentence ended the same way, with a pause, a breath, a glance toward the door. But the past has a way of surfacing whether you invite it or not, and as the case reopened, so did the town, reporters gathering outside the station, neighbors stopping each other in grocery store aisles, the name Emily Carter spoken aloud again after years of silence, and with it, the unspoken question everyone carried: how did we miss this? How did he pass through our lives unnoticed? Detectives went back to the diner, stood in the parking lot where she'd last been seen, the asphalt smoother now, the lines repainted, but the geometry the same, the blind spots still there, the dark corners where headlights wouldn't reach, and one of them noticed something in the old photographs, a car parked near the tree line, barely visible, dismissed at the time as background noise, now suddenly worth another look. They tracked down the original witness who had mentioned it in passing, a man who had been in his 20s then, now middle-aged, hesitant, unsure of his own memory, but certain of one thing: he remembered that car sitting too long, engine running, lights off, and he remembered thinking nothing of it, because in 2001, in Palm Ridge, you didn't expect monsters in parked sedans. The driver from the traffic stop denied being there, denied ever owning a similar car back then, but records told a different story: registration transfers, insurance gaps, a vehicle sold quietly months after Emily disappeared, and suddenly the timeline began to bend, not snapping into place, but flexing, hinting at a shape investigators hadn't seen before. Forensics stepped in where memory failed, the item from the trunk tested, fibers analyzed, DNA scraped from places no one had thought to check 2 decades earlier, and while results took time, the waiting itself was electric, every hour stretching thin, every phone call a potential fracture point, because cold cases don't reopen gently, they come apart in pieces. Meanwhile, the man's past was peeled back layer by layer: old addresses, former co-workers, ex-partners, patterns emerging not as proof but as suggestion, a history of sudden moves, of conflicts that never escalated far enough to involve police, of moments that looked ordinary until you stacked them side by side and noticed the rhythm, the repetition, the way trouble seemed to orbit him without ever landing. Investigators returned to witnesses they had spoken to years ago, now older, more cautious, sometimes more willing to talk, and in those conversations, new shadows formed: a neighbor who remembered seeing a stranger near Emily's apartment days before she vanished, a gas station clerk who recalled a man matching the driver's description buying fuel late that night, details that had once been useless now slotting into the empty spaces. But nothing was clean, nothing was definitive, every lead carried doubt, every recollection filtered through years of distance, and the defense attorneys knew it, watching from the sidelines, ready to dismantle anything that relied too heavily on memory rather than fact, because time is the best accomplice a crime can have. Inside the interview room, pressure mounted, questions sharpened, detectives began to test the man's story, confronting him with specifics, with dates, with evidence he couldn't easily explain, and his calm started to fray, answers growing shorter, irritation creeping in, the mask slipping just enough to reveal cracks beneath. Outside, Emily's family waited, caught between hope and dread, the reopening of the case reopening wounds they had learned to live around, every update a potential miracle or another disappointment, and when they heard about the traffic stop, about the evidence, about the interviews, they dared to imagine an ending for a story that had haunted them for most of their lives. But endings don't come easily to cases like this, and as detectives pushed forward, they ran headfirst into the same wall that had stopped the investigation years earlier: no body, no crime scene, no moment you could point to and say this is where it happened, just inference, just probability, just the heavy sense that the truth was close but still out of reach. The man was released pending further investigation, not charged, not cleared, walking out of the station under the gaze of cameras, his face carefully blank, and the community watched in disbelief, frustration bubbling over, the same anger they had felt 20 years ago rising again, because reopening a cold case doesn't guarantee justice, it only guarantees more waiting. Behind the scenes, detectives kept digging, combing through old phone records, triangulating cell towers that barely existed in 2001, reconstructing movements from fragments of data that technology had only recently made usable, and slowly, painstakingly, a map began to form, imperfect but suggestive, lines crossing in places that pointed back to Palm Ridge on the night Emily disappeared. The routine traffic stop had cracked the surface, but what lay beneath was deeper, darker, and far more complicated than anyone had expected, and as the investigation stretched on, one thing became clear: whatever happened in 2001 wasn't an isolated moment of violence, it was part of a longer story, one that had threaded quietly through years of ordinary life, unnoticed, waiting for the smallest mistake to bring it back into the light. And somewhere in that story, between a broken taillight and a vanished woman, lay a truth that refused to stay buried, a truth that had already begun to change everything, even as it continued to hide just out of reach. Time became the enemy again, not in the slow, dull way it had before, but sharp and pressing, every passing day threatening to dull the urgency, to let the reopened cold case slip back into familiar limbo, and investigators knew it. They felt the clock ticking in every interview, every lab request, every late-night meeting where coffee went cold untouched while they stared at evidence boards crowded with photos, names, arrows, and unanswered questions. The forensic results arrived in fragments, never all at once, never clean, each update a small jolt that raised more questions than it answered, fibers that matched a uniform Emily wore to work, traces that placed the item from the trunk in her possession at some point, but not when, not where, not how it had moved from her life into his car, and that gap, that missing bridge, loomed large enough for doubt to creep in. Detectives returned to the interview room with renewed intensity, not accusatory, not reckless, but relentless, pressing the man on details he'd glossed over before, his movements in 2001, his job at the time, his reasons for being anywhere near Palm Ridge, and with each pass, his story grew more precise and more fragile, specificity becoming its own liability, because lies require maintenance, and memory, real memory, rarely sounds rehearsed. He said he worked nights, said he drove long distances, said he stopped in small towns to rest, explanations that fit too many scenarios at once, and when confronted with records that contradicted him, he adjusted, recalibrated, shifting blame onto faulty paperwork, mistaken identity, the chaos of a life lived on the road. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was building walls instead of answers. Outside the station, the media fed on every leak, every rumor, headlines flashing across screens, cold case reopened, new person of interest, community demands answers, and in Palm Ridge, the unease thickened, parents checking locks again, strangers studied a little too long, the past reminding everyone how quickly safety could dissolve. Investigators dug deeper into the man's history, not just official records now, but the spaces between them, the years where nothing was documented, where he moved without leaving much trace, and in those gaps, patterns emerged, not crimes, not accusations, but proximity, always near, never caught, always passing through towns where something had gone wrong and no one could quite explain why. They tracked down former co-workers who remembered him as quiet, forgettable, someone who kept his head down, and former partners who described mood shifts they couldn't place, anger that flared and vanished, apologies that came too quickly, details that didn't prove anything but added texture to a portrait that was growing darker by the day. The case pulled investigators back into the night Emily vanished, reconstructing it minute by minute, the diner's closing routine, the last customer leaving, the staff clocking out, the sounds that would have carried across the parking lot, the ones that wouldn't, and in doing so, they confronted a chilling possibility that whatever happened had been swift, controlled, and silent enough to leave nothing behind. They revisited the original search area with new eyes, new technology, ground-penetrating radar sweeping over patches of land once cleared by volunteers with flashlights, and although nothing definitive surfaced, the act itself sent a message through the community that the past was being disturbed, that answers were being forced to the surface whether they wanted to come up or not. Emily's name echoed again in press conferences, in court filings, in late-night news segments, and for those who had known her, it felt like watching a ghost walk through the present, familiar and painful all at once, her smile frozen in old photographs now dissected for clues, her life reduced to timelines and evidence tags. The man from the traffic stop began to feel the pressure in ways he hadn't anticipated, neighbors recognizing him from the news, reporters circling, his anonymity stripped away piece by piece, and in private moments captured by surveillance and informants, his composure cracked, arguments with acquaintances escalating, a sense of control slipping. Detectives debated strategy behind closed doors, how hard to push, when to hold back, aware that one misstep could collapse the case entirely, because without a body, without a crime scene, everything hinged on accumulation, on building a narrative so tight that coincidence no longer had room to breathe. They turned to behavioral analysts, professionals who studied not what people said but how they lived, how they moved through the world after something terrible had happened, and the profile that emerged was unsettlingly plausible, a man capable of compartmentalization, of returning to normal life while carrying something dark beneath the surface, someone who could survive for years without confession because he never truly felt seen. As the investigation pressed on, an unexpected call shifted the ground beneath them, a former resident of Palm Ridge, now living states away, who had avoided speaking to police in 2001 out of fear, out of youth, out of the belief that what they knew didn't matter, and now, 2 decades later, they were ready to talk. The interview was tense, halting, fragments of memory pieced together with long pauses, but one detail cut through the fog, a late-night argument overheard near the diner, a man's voice raised, a woman's voice cut short, and a dark sedan pulling away faster than necessary, details dismissed at the time as nothing more than imagination, now suddenly terrifyingly specific. When shown photographs, the witness hesitated, then pointed, not with certainty, not with confidence, but with recognition, the kind that tightens the chest and refuses to let go, and investigators felt the shift immediately, the subtle but unmistakable sense that the case had crossed another threshold. Still, nothing was enough, not yet, every piece fragile, every memory contested, and the defense prepared its counterattack, experts ready to undermine eyewitness reliability, to exploit the gaps left by time, to remind everyone that suspicion is not proof. The pressure mounted on all sides, the reopened cold case threatening to collapse under its own weight, and in the middle of it all stood a truth that remained stubbornly incomplete, a night in 2001 that refused to be fully seen, a routine traffic stop that had cracked the door open, and an investigation now racing against time, against doubt, against the possibility that even after 20 years, some secrets were still determined to stay buried. And as detectives prepared their next move, one question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, whether reopening the case would finally bring answers, or simply prove that some disappearances leave scars deeper than evidence can reach. The investigation no longer moved quietly, it couldn't, not with cameras parked outside the station and reporters refreshing their feeds every hour. The reopened cold case had become a spectacle, and with that came pressure, not just to find the truth, but to find it fast, a dangerous demand when time had already eroded so much of what mattered. Inside the task force room, tension thickened, detectives arguing over strategy, over which leads to chase and which to let die, because every step forward risked 2 steps back, a witness pushed too hard, a piece of evidence handled one way instead of another, and the entire case could unravel before it ever reached a courtroom. The man at the center of it all hired an attorney with a reputation for dismantling old cases, someone who understood the weaknesses baked into time, and almost immediately, the tone shifted, interviews cut short, statements filtered through legal language, silence replacing the rambling explanations investigators had grown used to, and that silence was louder than anything he'd said before. Subpoenas followed, phone records, financial histories, travel logs, every scrap of data that could still be recovered from 2001, and what came back was incomplete, patchy, full of holes, carriers that no longer existed, banks that had merged and purged records, the past erasing itself faster than investigators could reconstruct it. Yet even in the gaps, something emerged, not a confession, not a smoking gun, but inconsistency, days unaccounted for, mileage that didn't line up, transactions made in places the man claimed he'd never been, small fractures that widened the more closely they were examined, and detectives circled them relentlessly. The witness who had finally come forward was placed under scrutiny, their account dissected, timelines challenged, memories tested against known facts, and though defense experts would later argue contamination and suggestion, investigators saw something else, fear, delayed but genuine, a person who had lived for years with the knowledge that they might have heard the last sounds of a woman's life. In Palm Ridge, the community split, some convinced justice was finally within reach, others wary, burned by years of speculation, unwilling to condemn without certainty, and in that divide, old arguments resurfaced, about safety, about trust, about whether monsters come from outside or grow quietly among us. Emily's family watched it all unfold from a distance that felt both protective and cruel, briefings filtered through victim advocates, their private grief now tangled with public debate, their daughter's name spoken by strangers who had never known her, and with every headline, hope flickered, threatened to burn out just as it had before. Investigators revisited the man's vehicle history again, focusing on a sale made shortly after Emily vanished, tracking down the buyer, then the buyer after that, uncovering alterations made to the car in the years that followed, upholstery replaced, panels repainted, nothing illegal, nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to suggest a desire to erase, to reset, to move on. A search warrant was finally issued, limited but crucial, allowing forensic teams to examine items that had once seemed ordinary, tools, storage units, properties long sold, and in one of those spaces, something surfaced that tightened every chest in the room, a trace, degraded but unmistakable, tying Emily to a place she should never have been. Still, the evidence danced just beyond certainty, each finding demanding context that time had stolen, and the legal clock ticked louder, prosecutors cautious, aware that bringing charges too soon could doom the case forever, that a failed trial would not just deny justice, it would seal the mystery for good. Behind closed doors, doubts crept in, not about the man's involvement, but about the system's ability to prove it, to translate years of suspicion into minutes of courtroom clarity, and in those moments, detectives confronted a hard truth, that solving a cold case isn't about knowing what happened, it's about convincing 12 strangers beyond a reasonable doubt. The man's behavior shifted under the weight of scrutiny, routines changing, associates distancing themselves, a sense of isolation setting in, and informants reported sleeplessness, agitation, a growing paranoia, signs that the pressure was reaching places evidence could not. As weeks turned into months, the case teetered, one strong lead away from momentum, one misstep away from collapse, and then, unexpectedly, a detail overlooked for years resurfaced, buried in an old tip-line log, a call dismissed as unreliable, a voice describing a late-night encounter on Highway 17, a car pulled over, lights flashing briefly, then darkness, a moment that hadn't fit any theory at the time. Investigators listened to the recording again, heard the uncertainty, the hesitation, the lack of specifics that had made it easy to ignore, and now, with everything else on the board, it sounded different, less like noise, more like a missing thread. They tracked down the caller, older now, harder to find, and when they finally sat down across from them, the story came back in pieces, sharper than before, a traffic stop that hadn't been official, lights that weren't police issue, a woman standing outside a car, and then nothing, a memory that had haunted them quietly for years. The implication landed hard, not just about Emily's fate, but about the method, about how someone could control a situation so quickly, so completely, and as investigators absorbed it, they realized the case was no longer just about a disappearance, it was about a pattern, a confidence, a man who may have used routine itself as a weapon. The cold case had shifted again, not closer to resolution, but deeper, darker, revealing layers that made the truth feel both nearer and more elusive than ever, and as the task force prepared to act on this new angle, one thing was certain, whatever happened on that Florida road in 2001 was far from random, and the routine traffic stop that reopened the case was no accident of fate, it was a mirror held up to a crime that had always hidden in plain sight. The smallest details often carry the heaviest consequences, and in this case, it was a technical footnote buried deep in a report that began to pull everything apart, a line of data most people would skim past without noticing, but to the investigators who had lived with this case for months, it felt like a pulse, faint but undeniable. It came from a device that barely existed in 2001, primitive by modern standards, unreliable, often dismissed in court, but still capable of leaving behind a shadow, a cellular ping recorded during a narrow window of time on the night Emily vanished, a moment when a signal touched a tower just long enough to be logged before disappearing again, and when analysts mapped it against known movements, the result was unsettling. The ping placed the man's phone within a corridor of space that intersected Highway 17, not directly at the diner, not close enough to be definitive, but close enough to contradict his claims of being nowhere near Palm Ridge that night, and once that contradiction existed, everything else began to shift. Detectives revisited his statements, comparing versions side by side, noting where the timeline bent, where his certainty had grown sharper over the years instead of softer, an unnatural clarity that suggested rehearsal rather than recollection, and with each comparison, the margin for innocence narrowed. Prosecutors were briefed cautiously, their enthusiasm tempered by experience, because they knew how fragile technical evidence from that era could be, how easily it could be dismantled by experts who specialized in reminding juries that technology lies as often as people do, and yet, even they couldn't ignore the accumulating weight. The dominoes began to fall quietly, one by one, a former acquaintance contacting investigators after seeing the man's face on television, recalling a strange conversation years earlier about Florida, about a night that had gone wrong, words vague enough to dismiss at the time, now impossible to forget, and when pressed, the acquaintance admitted they had always felt something was off, but had never imagined it mattered. Investigators followed that thread carefully, aware that memory reshapes itself under retention, but the account lined up in ways that were hard to ignore, the timing, the geography, the emotional tone, not a confession, but an echo, reinforcing the shape of a story they were beginning to understand. Pressure mounted on the man as the walls closed in, his attorney pushing back aggressively, filing motions, challenging warrants, attacking witness credibility before charges had even been filed, a clear signal that they felt the ground shifting too, that the case was no longer theoretical. In Palm Ridge, anxiety hardened into something sharper, not just fear now, but anticipation, a collective holding of breath, and as the reopened cold case dominated local news, people began to revisit their own memories, moments they had filed away as insignificant suddenly glowing with unease, a late-night drive, an unfamiliar car, a face glimpsed and forgotten. Emily's family received another call, another briefing, and though they had learned not to hope too loudly, something in the investigators' tone felt different this time, more deliberate, less speculative, and for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to imagine that the waiting might eventually end. The task force narrowed its focus, shifting from broad reconstruction to targeted pressure, revisiting the man's movements in the weeks after Emily disappeared, and there, another anomaly surfaced, a sudden, unexplained trip out of state, no clear purpose, no receipts that matched the distance traveled, and though the trip itself proved nothing, it added urgency to a timeline already under strain. They looked again at the area surrounding Highway 17, the stretches of road where a car could pull over unnoticed, where headlights vanished into darkness, where control could be exerted quickly and quietly, and the earlier witness account of flashing lights that weren't police issue took on new significance, no longer an outlier, but a potential key. Investigators tested the theory, reconstructing the scenario, mapping lines of sight, calculating how long it would take to move from the diner to the roadside location described, and the numbers aligned too well to dismiss, each calculation tightening the net. The man was called back in for another interview, this time under a different tone entirely, no casual circling, no gentle probing, just a steady presentation of contradictions, of data points that eroded his story piece by piece, and as they spoke, they watched him closely, noting the subtle shifts, the clenched jaw, the sudden defensiveness, the moments where his eyes fixed on nothing at all. He denied everything again, more forcefully now, frustration bleeding into anger, accusing investigators of harassment, of desperation, of building a case out of thin air, but his outrage felt rehearsed, a performance meant to replace explanation, and when the interview ended, it left behind more questions than answers. Behind the scenes, a decision loomed, whether to move forward with charges on a circumstantial foundation, or to keep digging, risking leaks, risking mistakes, risking the slow erosion of momentum, and the debate cut deep, seasoned professionals split between caution and resolve. Then came the mistake, small, human, inevitable under pressure, a document filed too early, a detail made public before it should have been, and the defense seized on it instantly, spinning it into a narrative of incompetence, of bias, of a task force grasping for relevance, and suddenly the case wasn't just about Emily Carter anymore, it was about credibility. The media amplified the misstep, headline shifting tone, questions raised in reopened cold case, and the public's confidence wavered. The fragile trust investigators had rebuilt threatening to collapse again under scrutiny. Inside the task force room, the atmosphere darkened, every move now shadowed by the risk of another error, every decision weighed against the possibility of handing the defense exactly what it wanted, and yet, retreat was no longer an option. Because beneath the noise, beneath the legal maneuvers and public doubt, the shape of the truth was clearer than it had ever been, a pattern of control, of calculated risk, of a man who understood routine well enough to weaponize it, and a crime that had relied on the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough, long enough, to see it for what it was. The cold case stood on the edge again, not frozen this time, but burning, fragile, dangerous, and as investigators prepared for the next phase, they knew that whatever happened next would determine whether Emily Carter's disappearance would finally be answered, or whether it would slip back into silence, leaving behind only questions and the quiet devastation of another almost. The case entered its most unstable phase not with a dramatic revelation, but with silence, the kind that settles in after momentum stalls, when everyone involved understands that one wrong move could erase years of work in a single ruling, and that silence pressed down on the task force like weight. Prosecutors slowed everything to a crawl, reviewing every document, every warrant, every interview transcript, not because they doubted what they believed had happened, but because belief had never won a case, and this one, balanced on circumstantial evidence stretched across 2 decades, would not survive even the smallest fracture. The defense sensed it immediately, the hesitation, the recalibration, and moved aggressively, filing motions to suppress the cellular data, to exclude the late-coming witness testimony, to frame the entire investigation as a narrative retrofitted around a man unlucky enough to be pulled over for a broken taillight, and in those filings, the words were sharp, deliberate, accusing the state of resurrecting a ghost without proof it had ever existed. Inside the task force room, the mood hardened, detectives poring over timelines again, questioning their own assumptions, re-examining what they thought they knew, because cold cases have a way of punishing certainty, and no one wanted to be the reason this one collapsed. Then the witness began to falter. The same person who had finally spoken after years of silence, whose account had shifted the case's trajectory, now hesitated under renewed scrutiny, second-guessing details, retreating from earlier confidence, the weight of attention pressing in, friends urging caution, the defense quietly reminding them what happens to memories under cross-examination. Investigators watched it happen in real time, the slow erosion of resolve, and there was nothing they could do to stop it without making it worse, because pressure cuts both ways, and too much of it turns allies into liabilities. Emily's family was informed carefully, gently, told that witnesses sometimes struggle, that this didn't mean the truth had changed, only that telling it had become harder, but the explanation offered little comfort, the familiar fear returning, the sense that the ground beneath them was starting to give way again. Meanwhile, new information surfaced from an unexpected source, a routine audit of old evidence logs revealing that an item originally logged in 2001 had been mishandled, not lost, not destroyed, but improperly catalogued, its chain of custody blurred just enough to give the defense ammunition, and the discovery landed like a blow. It wasn't the item itself that mattered anymore, it was the implication, the suggestion that the investigation, both then and now, had been sloppy, that corners had been cut, and in the courtroom of public opinion, perception mattered almost as much as fact. The media pounced, commentators dissecting every misstep, every procedural flaw, turning complexity into accusation, and in Palm Ridge, skepticism spread, not about Emily's disappearance, but about whether the system was capable of handling it fairly. The man at the center of the case grew more confident as doubt spread, his public demeanor shifting, statements released through his attorney emphasizing presumption of innocence, framing the investigation as harassment resurrected by nostalgia and pressure rather than evidence, and for the first time, investigators felt the case slipping out of their control. Behind closed doors, hard conversations took place about whether to pause, whether to wait, whether to risk letting the cold case go cold again, and those conversations were haunted by a single reality: time had already done enough damage, there would not be another chance like this. Then came the quiet breakthrough. Not from a lab, not from a witness, but from a pattern noticed by an analyst who had no emotional investment in the case, just a spreadsheet and a question: why did the man's travel behavior change so dramatically after 2001? Not immediately, not explosively, but subtly: fewer stops, shorter stays, routes that avoided certain regions entirely. The pattern didn't prove guilt, but it suggested avoidance, a life reorganized around something unspoken, and when mapped against unsolved incidents in neighboring states, it raised a possibility investigators had resisted until now: that Emily's disappearance might not have been an isolated event. The implication was dangerous, legally and ethically, but impossible to ignore, because if true, it reframed everything, not as a single tragedy, but as part of a longer arc of behavior that had simply gone unnoticed. Prosecutors were briefed again, this time with caution bordering on reluctance, aware that introducing the idea of a pattern without concrete proof could backfire catastrophically, yet equally aware that ignoring it might mean missing the only context that made the case coherent. As the legal battles intensified, the witness made a decision, requesting another meeting with investigators, and when they sat down together, the tension was palpable, the air heavy with what might be said or unsaid, and after a long pause, the witness admitted the truth: not that they had lied, but that fear had returned, fear of being wrong, fear of being responsible for the outcome, fear of standing alone under the glare of a courtroom. Investigators listened, said little, understanding that this was the human cost of delay, of reopening wounds that had been left to scar over, and when the meeting ended, they faced a choice that cut to the heart of the case: proceed without the witnesses' full confidence, or risk losing them entirely. The decision was made quietly, without ceremony, to move forward, not because the case was perfect, but because waiting for perfection would mean waiting forever, and with that decision came a shift, subtle but irreversible: the investigation no longer about whether to act, but how. The reopened cold case had reached the point of no return, battered by doubt, undermined by time, but still burning, and as the task force prepared to present its findings formally, they knew that the next phase would determine not just the fate of one man, but whether Emily Carter's disappearance would finally be acknowledged as a crime that mattered enough to be fought for, even when certainty remained just out of reach. The shift from investigation to confrontation happened without ceremony, no dramatic announcement, no sense of closure, just a calendar date circled in red and a room prepared for arguments that would decide whether the past was strong enough to stand in the present. When prosecutors formally presented the case, it wasn't with confidence, but with resolve, a careful assembly of facts, timelines, and inferences laid out not as a promise of certainty, but as a demand to be taken seriously, and in that distinction lay both the strength and fragility of everything that followed. The defense responded exactly as expected: forceful, surgical, attacking not what the state believed, but how it had come to believe it, framing the entire narrative as a product of hindsight bias, of investigators desperate to solve a 20-year-old mystery and willing to bend ambiguity into accusation. In that room, Emily Carter's name was spoken repeatedly, stripped of warmth, reduced to a reference point, and every time it happened, those who had known her felt the sting of it, the reminder that justice often requires a kind of emotional violence, turning lives into exhibits. The judge listened, expression unreadable, weighing not guilt, but admissibility, not truth, but procedure, and when the rulings began to come down, they landed unevenly, some evidence allowed, some excluded, some left hanging, deferred, unresolved, and with each decision, the shape of the case changed, tightening here, fraying there. The cellular data survived, weakened but intact, framed now as suggestive rather than definitive, the late-coming witness allowed to testify but under strict limitations, their uncertainty acknowledged up front, and the mishandled evidence ruled admissible with a warning, a caveat that would echo loudly in any jury's mind. Outside the courthouse, the story hardened into sides, supporters and skeptics trading arguments in comments sections and talk radio segments. The reopened cold case no longer just a mystery, but a referendum on belief itself, on whether time should diminish accountability or deepen it. Inside, the man sat motionless, his posture controlled, eyes forward, every visible movement calculated, and those who studied behavior noticed the discipline it took to maintain that stillness, the effort required to keep emotion contained when the past is dissected in public. The witness, once a footnote, now carried enormous weight, and as their testimony approached, pressure closed in from every direction: legal teams, media, personal doubt, and when they took the stand, their voice shook not with deception, but with fear, the fear of being wrong amplified by the knowledge that wrongness here could destroy lives. They told their story carefully, hesitating where memory blurred, admitting uncertainty where certainty would have been easier, and in that honesty lay both credibility and vulnerability, the defense seizing every pause, every correction, framing doubt as unreliability, uncertainty as invention. Prosecutors countered not by inflating the testimony, but by contextualizing it, reminding the court that memory does not improve with time, that silence does not equal absence, and that fear is often the most honest explanation for delay. The judge allowed it to stand, and the air in the room shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the sense that the case had survived another test, though not without scars. Then came the moment everyone had anticipated and dreaded, the presentation of the pattern, not as accusation, not as a list of crimes, but as context, a behavioral arc drawn carefully to avoid overreach, and even so, it was explosive, the suggestion that Emily Carter's disappearance fit within something larger, something unfinished. The defense objected immediately, arguing prejudice, arguing speculation, and for a tense stretch of minutes, the case hung in suspension, everyone aware that the ruling could reshape everything. When the judge allowed limited reference, narrowly defined, the reaction was immediate: gasps in the gallery, headlines already forming, and the man's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a tightening of the jaw, a breath held too long, a sign that something had landed where it wasn't supposed to. Behind the scenes, investigators watched with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that introducing the pattern had strengthened the narrative but also raised the stakes, because now the case was no longer just about one night in 2001, it was about whether the system could confront a truth that extended beyond a single victim. Emily's family sat together, hands clasped, absorbing each development in silence, the legal language washing over them, translating internally into something simpler and more painful: whether their daughter mattered enough to keep fighting for, even when certainty remained elusive. As proceedings stretched on, exhaustion set in, legal arguments looping, motions layered atop motions, and in that fatigue, cracks appeared on both sides, prosecutors pushing harder, defense counsel growing sharper, tempers flaring just enough to reveal the strain beneath professionalism. Then, late in the process, something unexpected happened, not a revelation, not a confession, but a withdrawal, the witness requesting a brief recess, visibly shaken, and when court resumed, they added a detail they had not shared before, small, almost apologetic, but precise, a smell they remembered from that night: oil and metal, the interior of a car, not imagined, but recalled with sudden clarity. The defense pounced, accusing coaching, contamination, desperation, but the judge allowed it, noting that memory is not linear, that recall can surface unpredictably, and once again, the case held, battered but standing. The confrontation continued, day after day, the past dragged forward inch by inch, resisting, fragmenting, refusing to resolve cleanly, and as the legal battle wore on, one truth became unavoidable: no matter how this ended, the reopened cold case had already changed everything, exposing how thin the line is between routine and catastrophe, between forgetting and accountability. And as the court adjourned for the day, the man was led away, still uncharged, still officially innocent, but no longer untouched by the weight of the story closing in around him, a story that refused to stay buried, that demanded to be heard, even if it never fully revealed its ending. The turning point didn't arrive with a confession or a document pulled from a forgotten box, it came through erosion, the slow, relentless wearing down of control, the kind that happens when a person is forced to listen to their own story told back to them from every angle until it no longer sounds like something they own. The man began to unravel in small, almost imperceptible ways, nothing dramatic, no outbursts, just shifts, a missed appointment, a delayed response, a decision that suggested distraction rather than confidence, and those who watched him closely understood what it meant: the weight of sustained attention was beginning to press inward. His attorney noticed it too, tightening their grip, limiting exposure, canceling interviews, issuing statements instead of allowing questions, a defensive cocoon designed to preserve the image of calm, but the effort itself betrayed strain, because innocence doesn't usually require this much maintenance. behind the scenes, investigators leaned into psychology rather than pressure, not interrogations now, but observation, tracking patterns of behavior under stress, noting when he retreated, when he overcorrected, when he attempted to reassert control in ways that felt unnecessary, and in those patterns, something familiar emerged. They saw it in the way he spoke about Emily, distant, abstract, never angry, never emotional, as if discussing a concept rather than a person, a detachment that stood out against the rawness of everyone else involved, and that detachment became a thread worth pulling. A behavioral analyst suggested a shift in approach, not confrontation, but invitation, creating space for the man to speak freely without the immediate threat of accusation, not to trap him, but to see what surfaced when he believed he was being understood rather than challenged. The meeting was arranged quietly, informal by design, no recording equipment visible, no aggressive posture, just two people talking in a room, and at first, it worked exactly as intended. The man relaxed, spoke more openly about his life, his frustrations, his sense of being misunderstood, his resentment toward a world he felt had always been slightly out of reach. Then, without prompting, he returned to the night in 2001. Not defensively, not angrily, but with an odd familiarity, details offered without being asked, corrections to questions that hadn't yet been posed, and investigators felt it immediately, that subtle but unmistakable signal. He wasn't recalling, he was reliving. He spoke about roads, about timing, about how quickly things can change when people assume safety, language that skirted the edge of confession without crossing it, and every sentence tightened the room, because while nothing he said was overtly incriminating, everything he said assumed a knowledge no innocent bystander should possess. The interview ended without confrontation, without acknowledgement of what had just happened, but the impact lingered, and when investigators compared notes afterward, the consensus was quiet and unanimous. Something had shifted irreversibly. At the same time, pressure from the outside intensified, not just media scrutiny now, but institutional, questions from oversight committees, concerns about precedent, about the risks of building cases on behavioral inference and delayed memory, and in that pressure, the case threatened to fracture along philosophical lines. Emily's family felt the tension acutely, updates becoming less frequent, more guarded, the language of certainty replaced by careful phrasing, and with that came a familiar fear, the sense that the system was preparing to step back, to protect itself rather than push forward. Then came the call no one expected. A man from out of state contacted the task force, his voice hesitant, his story incomplete, but his reason for calling clear. He had recognized details in the coverage, not names or faces, but methods, descriptions of behavior that mirrored something he had lived with and tried to forget. He spoke of a relationship years earlier, of control disguised as routine, of moments that felt wrong but were easy to excuse at the time, and as he talked, investigators felt the ground shift again, not because the story confirmed guilt, but because it aligned too neatly with the behavioral pattern they had begun to outline. They listened carefully, aware of the danger of confirmation bias, but the details came unprompted, specific, mundane, and unsettling, habits, phrases, responses to stress that matched what they had observed firsthand, and when asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, the answer was simple: he hadn't known it mattered until now. The information was logged, verified where possible, and though it could not be used directly, it reshaped the internal understanding of the case, reinforcing the sense that Emily's disappearance was not an anomaly, but an escalation. The man sensed the shift again, even without being told, his behavior tightening further, isolation deepening, and those around him noticed the change, a growing edge of desperation, moments where his carefully constructed neutrality slipped into irritation, then anger, then silence. In court, the atmosphere reflected it, arguments growing sharper, patience thinner, the judge increasingly aware that the case was balancing not just evidence, but psychological momentum, and in that space, truth had a way of surfacing indirectly. During a routine exchange, a minor inconsistency slipped through, a correction offered too quickly, a reference to a detail that had never been entered into the record, and though it passed unnoticed by most, investigators caught it immediately, the kind of slip that happens when internal reality collides with external narrative. It wasn't enough to act on, not yet, but it added to the quiet accumulation, the sense that the story being told publicly no longer aligned cleanly with the one being carried privately. As the days stretched on, exhaustion began to strip away artifice from everyone involved, and in that exhaustion, moments of honesty surfaced unexpectedly, not declarations, not admissions, but cracks, fleeting, fragile, impossible to preserve but impossible to ignore. The reopened cold case had entered a strange phase, no longer about discovery, but about endurance, about which version of events could withstand the longest exposure to light, and as investigators prepared for the next step, they understood that the resolution, if it came at all, would not arrive cleanly. Because some truths don't emerge all at once, they leak, slowly, through behavior, through contradiction, through the simple inability to carry a lie indefinitely, and somewhere in that leakage, the answer to what happened in Florida in 2001 was beginning to show itself, not as certainty, but as something far more dangerous, inevitability. The decision came quietly, without drama, without applause, delivered in measured language that masked how irreversible it truly was. The prosecutors would move forward, not because the case was perfect, not because every doubt had been erased, but because waiting any longer would mean accepting that time itself could veto accountability. The filing landed like a low-frequency shock, charges initiated not as a declaration of certainty, but as an assertion that the story assembled over months of pressure, contradiction, and pattern deserved to be tested under the highest scrutiny available, and with that, the reopened cold case crossed a line it could not retreat from. The defense reacted instantly, publicly calm, privately aggressive, motions stacking up overnight, emergency hearings requested, a final attempt to stop momentum before it became unstoppable, and in that scramble, something shifted again, not in the courtroom, but in the man himself. Those closest to him noticed it first, a change in cadence, in routine, sleep fractured, appetite erratic, a restlessness that bled into everything, and when confronted, he dismissed it as stress, as persecution, as the cost of being misunderstood, but the explanation rang hollow even to those who wanted to believe it. Investigators tightened their focus, not to provoke, not to intimidate, but to observe, aware that this stage often revealed what evidence could not, how a person behaves when the future narrows, when control slips, when the narrative they've relied on begins to fracture under its own weight. The court hearings unfolded in rapid succession, legal language flying thick and fast, objections raised, countered, deferred, and through it all, the judge maintained a careful distance, aware that every ruling would ripple outward, shaping not just this case, but how old cases might be treated in the future. Emily's family attended quietly, absorbing the proceedings with a kind of numb endurance, the legal framing of their daughter's disappearance both validating and alienating, her name now anchored to charges rather than questions, a shift they had waited years to see but never imagined would feel so heavy. Outside, the community's mood shifted again, not to relief, not to celebration, but to tension, an awareness that the story was entering a phase where it could no longer remain abstract, where an outcome, whatever it was, would have consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. Then came the incident no one had anticipated but everyone would later fixate on. Late one evening, after a long day of hearings, the man was involved in a minor altercation, nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, but revealing, a confrontation sparked by a perceived slight, escalating faster than expected, ending with raised voices and a sudden, disproportionate reaction that drew attention. Witnesses described it inconsistently, but one detail repeated, a moment of panic when control seemed to slip, a flash of something raw beneath the practiced calm, and though it led to no charges, it was documented, noted, added quietly to the growing profile. The defense moved to downplay it, calling it irrelevant, inflammatory, but investigators saw it differently, not as proof, but as context, another data point in a pattern of stress responses that aligned too closely with what they had already observed. As trial preparation intensified, the witness who had wavered earlier reached out again, not with new information, but with resolve, stating simply that they were ready to testify fully, whatever the cost, the hesitation gone, replaced by something steadier, acceptance rather than certainty. The shift mattered, not because it strengthened the case materially, but because it changed its tone, from fragile to deliberate, and prosecutors adjusted their strategy accordingly, narrowing focus, reducing reliance on anything that could be dismissed as speculative. Behind the scenes, investigators revisited the behavioral interview from weeks earlier, transcribing it line by line, analyzing phrasing, sequence, corrections, and in doing so, they noticed something they had missed in the moment, a temporal error, a reference to timing that conflicted subtly with the official record, not enough to accuse, but enough to confirm that the man's internal timeline did not match the public one. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but in a case built on accumulation, it mattered, another grain added to the scale. As the trial date approached, pressure mounted everywhere at once, legal teams working late, families bracing, the community watching with a mixture of hope and dread, and through it all, the sense grew that whatever happened next would not bring closure in the way people expected. Because closure implies certainty, and this case had never offered that, only a narrowing of possibilities, a convergence of evidence and behavior pointing toward a truth that remained just beyond the reach of absolute proof. On the eve of a critical hearing, the man made a request through his attorney, a private conversation with investigators, off the record, no guarantees, no deals, just a conversation, and when the request reached the task force, the room went quiet. They debated it intensely, aware of the risks, of how easily such meetings could be misinterpreted, exploited, or dismissed, and yet, they also recognized the moment for what it was, a fracture, an opening created not by pressure, but by exhaustion. The meeting was scheduled. No promises were made, no expectations set, and as investigators prepared, they understood that whatever was said in that room might never be admissible, might never be provable, but could still change everything. Because sometimes, the most important truths don't arrive as evidence, they arrive as choices, the decision to speak or to remain silent, to maintain control or to let it go, and in that choice, the story of what happened in Florida in 2001 was about to confront its most dangerous moment yet. The room was deliberately unremarkable, chosen for its neutrality, no recording equipment visible, no mirrors, no sense of theater, just a table, 3 chairs, and a silence thick enough to feel intentional, and when the man entered, escorted but unrestrained, he looked smaller than he had in court, not diminished, but exposed. The investigators did not rush him, did not frame the meeting as an opportunity or a trap, they simply acknowledged his request and waited, understanding that in conversations like this, the first words that mattered were rarely spoken aloud. Minutes passed before he spoke, and when he did, it was not a confession, not even an admission, but a complaint, a frustration voiced with careful restraint, about how the case had spiraled, how assumptions had hardened into narratives, how life could be consumed by something that, in his words, never happened the way they think it did. They listened without interruption, letting him build his version uninterrupted, noting not just what he said, but what he avoided, names omitted, dates blurred, actions described in passive language, as if events had occurred without agency, without hands guiding them. When the first question came, it was simple, almost gentle, asking him to clarify a detail he had mentioned casually, a reference to a location that had never been publicly disclosed, a place investigators had deliberately kept out of filings, out of media coverage, out of every official narrative. He paused. The pause was brief, barely perceptible, but it landed heavily in the room, and when he corrected himself, backtracking slightly, rephrasing, the damage was already done, because the correction revealed something more telling than the mistake itself, familiarity. He attempted to regain control, shifting tone, framing his knowledge as rumor, as community talk, as coincidence, but the explanation strained under its own weight, and the investigators, careful not to confront directly, allowed the inconsistency to hang, unchallenged, a mirror he could not stop glancing into. As the conversation unfolded, patterns emerged, emotional spikes where logic should have prevailed, defensiveness around moments no one had accused him of, clarity in places where memory should have faded, and vagueness where specificity would have helped him most. At one point, he laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt out of place, explaining that people wanted monsters, not men, and that once a story decided who you were, truth became irrelevant, and though the statement sounded philosophical, it landed more like a justification than an observation. The investigators shifted tactics subtly, moving away from facts and toward choices, asking not what happened, but why certain decisions had been made, why some actions followed others, why silence had lasted as long as it had. That was when the tone changed. His answers slowed, sentences growing heavier, less polished, the practiced narrative beginning to fray at the edges, and in one moment, unguarded and brief, he acknowledged fear, not of conviction, but of being remembered incorrectly. The admission was quiet, almost reflective, and for a second, the room softened, until he added something else, a conditional statement, hypothetical, offered as an aside, about how things might have unfolded differently if she hadn't trusted the wrong person. No name was spoken. No accusation was made. But the shift was unmistakable, the language no longer abstract, no longer distant, and the investigators noted it immediately, recognizing the pivot from defense to displacement, the subtle move of responsibility outward. They pressed carefully, asking who he meant, inviting clarification, but he retreated again, closing ranks, reminding them the conversation was off the record, that he had agreed to talk, not to incriminate himself, and the wall slid back into place. The meeting ended not with revelation, but with residue, statements that could not be quoted, insights that could not be introduced, but which reshaped the investigators' understanding of where pressure might still be applied, and more importantly, where it should not. After he left, the room remained silent for a long moment. No one spoke until one investigator finally summarized what they all felt, not triumph, not frustration, but confirmation, not of guilt in a legal sense, but of proximity, that the man was not orbiting the truth, he was standing close enough to feel its heat. In the days that followed, prosecutors adjusted again, not in response to anything said explicitly, but to what the conversation revealed implicitly: tightening timelines, refining language, removing assumptions, ensuring that if the case moved forward, it would do so without relying on anything that could be dismissed as interpretation. Meanwhile, word of the meeting leaked, not in detail, but in implication, enough to reignite speculation, to fracture public opinion once more, with some seeing it as a sign of weakness, others as a calculated move, and a few as something more ominous. Emily's family was informed carefully, told only that the meeting had occurred, not what had been discussed, and while the lack of detail was frustrating, it also carried an unexpected comfort, the sense that something unseen had shifted, even if it could not yet be named. Then, late one night, as investigators reviewed old files yet again, one of them noticed something newly relevant, a report dismissed years earlier, not because it was false, but because it had arrived too early, before anyone knew what questions to ask. The report described a sound, a disturbance, a brief encounter that had never been corroborated, but now, viewed through the lens of everything that had followed, aligned too closely with the emerging narrative to ignore. The timing fit. The location fit. And most importantly, the detail the witness had been unsure of years ago now matched something the man had referenced inadvertently during the off-the-record conversation. The realization spread slowly through the room, the kind of quiet that signals recognition rather than surprise, and with it came a shift from preparation to anticipation. Because this was no longer about whether the case could be argued. It was about whether the truth, long buried under time, fear, and imperfect memory, was finally ready to surface, not as a dramatic confession or a single decisive piece of evidence, but as a convergence, undeniable in its totality. And as dawn approached, one investigator said what none of them had dared to say aloud before. They were no longer chasing the past. The past was moving toward them. Morning arrived without ceremony, a thin gray light pressing against the edges of the building as if the day itself were hesitant to witness what might follow, and inside the task force room, no one spoke about conclusions, no one used words like closure or resolution, because those belonged to stories with endings, and this was not one of them. The newly revived report was laid out on the table, its pages yellowed, corners bent, the handwriting uneven, the kind of document that had once been skimmed and set aside, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked context, and now, decades later, context had finally arrived, heavy and unavoidable. The witness had described the sound first, not a scream, not a crash, but something softer, a muffled disturbance that didn't fit neatly into categories, followed by a fleeting image, a silhouette near the roadside, a car idling longer than it should have, headlights dimmed, engine running, and then nothing, the kind of moment that dissolves almost immediately into doubt. Back then, investigators had asked the wrong questions, pressed for certainty where there was none, and when the witness hesitated, when memory wavered, the report lost its gravity, filed away under possibilities, not facts, and the case moved on without it. Now, reread line by line, the ambiguity felt different, not like weakness, but like honesty, and when aligned with the modern timeline, with cell tower pings, traffic data, and that offhand reference slipped during a supposedly off-the-record conversation, the report stopped being speculative and started becoming structural. Still, it was not enough. It never was. The law demands edges, boundaries, proof that can survive cross-examination, and what they had was convergence, a tightening circle of implication, powerful, persuasive, but maddeningly intangible. Prosecutors debated strategy deep into the afternoon, voices low, measured, arguing not about guilt, but about risk, about what would happen if they moved too soon, if they reached for a verdict without securing the ground beneath it, because failure now would not just acquit a suspect, it would harden the past permanently. Outside the building, the story grew again. Media vans returned, cameras angled toward doors that refused to open, headlines recycling familiar language, cold case reopened, shocking new developments, investigators tight-lipped, and the public, restless and divided, filled the silence with speculation, some convinced justice was finally imminent, others certain the system was circling another innocent life. Emily's name reappeared everywhere. On screens. On placards. In whispered conversations at grocery stores and gas stations. But the person Emily had been, the girl with habits and dreams and contradictions, receded once more behind the symbol she had become, a reminder that unresolved stories have a way of flattening those at their center. Her family felt the tension acutely, each update both hopeful and exhausting, each delay a reminder that progress did not always move forward, sometimes it simply narrowed the distance between certainty and doubt without crossing it. Then came the decision. Not an arrest. Not a charge. but a recalibration. Investigators announced they were pursuing additional corroboration, re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining physical evidence with updated techniques, language carefully chosen to suggest momentum without promise, movement without commitment. Privately, they acknowledged what could not be said aloud. They were close. Close enough to feel the weight of the truth pressing back. Close enough that the wrong step could shatter everything. The man remained free, visible but altered, his routine disrupted by attention, his words parsed endlessly, his silences louder than any denial, and though he spoke publicly only once, insisting again that he had been misunderstood, that the case was built on coincidence and obsession, the strain beneath the statement was unmistakable. He was no longer watching from the outside. He was waiting. Months passed. Then more. The cold case unit continued its work, quietly, methodically, following leads that refused to announce themselves as breakthroughs, building a case that might one day stand, or might collapse under its own complexity, and every investigator involved understood the same truth. Some cases do not end with answers. They end with pressure. Pressure on memory. Pressure on conscience. Pressure on time itself. And sometimes, that pressure is enough. Sometimes it is not. Florida 2001 remains unresolved. Reopened, re-examined, reshaped, but not closed. The road where it began looks ordinary now, cars passing without hesitation, no sign marking the moment where something slipped out of alignment and never fully returned, but those who know the story feel it when they drive by, the faint sense that the past is still there, waiting, not hidden, not erased, just unfinished. Because a cold case does not stay cold forever. It either breaks or it lingers. And this one, breathing just beneath the surface, refuses to let go. Time does not move evenly in unresolved cases, it stretches and contracts, accelerates in public moments and crawls in private ones, and after the announcement faded from headlines, after the cameras moved on to fresher disasters, what remained was not silence but a low, constant hum, the sound of a story refusing to settle. Inside the cold case unit, the work narrowed into something almost ritualistic, old evidence handled with new restraint, not because technology had suddenly become miraculous, but because experience had taught them where not to look, which assumptions had poisoned earlier efforts, which shortcuts had cost them years. Boxes were opened again. Not the dramatic ones. Not the evidence everyone remembered. But the forgotten margins, the side notes, the supplemental reports written at 2 a.m. by officers who sensed something was off but couldn't articulate why, documents that didn't scream relevance, only discomfort. One analyst focused on movement. Not motive. Not identity. Movement. Cars entering and exiting zones that no longer existed the same way, roads rerouted, intersections redesigned, landmarks erased, and when those patterns were reconstructed, layer by layer, a corridor emerged, subtle but persistent, a path that did not prove anything on its own but suggested familiarity, repetition, confidence. Confidence is rarely random. Another investigator revisited witness statements, not to verify facts, but to measure emotion, noting where voices tightened, where sentences shortened, where people became defensive without being challenged, and it became clear that the case had always been less about what was seen and more about what people were afraid to say. Fear leaves fingerprints too. They just don't show up under ultraviolet light. Meanwhile, the man at the center of speculation adjusted again. His public life contracted. He changed routines. Avoided certain routes. Stopped correcting rumors. The absence of denial became its own statement, interpreted endlessly by strangers who felt entitled to certainty, and though none of it rose to the level of evidence, it altered the psychological landscape of the case. Pressure does not need to be visible to be effective. It only needs to be felt. Emily's family learned to live in a state of suspended expectation, every phone call triggering a surge of adrenaline, every quiet week a test of endurance, and while they never asked investigators to promise anything, the unspoken question lingered in every interaction. How close is close? No one answered. Because closeness, in cases like this, is not a distance. It is a weight. As months slipped into another year, one development did occur, small enough to miss, significant enough to matter, a secondary witness, previously dismissed as unreliable due to age and inconsistency, agreed to speak again, not because memory had improved, but because perspective had. Age had stripped away fear. What remained was regret. The conversation was halting, filled with qualifiers and apologies, but buried within it was a detail that had never been emphasized before, not a face, not a license plate, but a behavior, a hesitation, a pause before a decision, something the witness now recognized because they had seen it in someone else years later. Pattern recognition does not require perfect memory. It requires honesty. The detail did not close the case. It did not unlock a door. But it reinforced the shape of the corridor, narrowed it further, made it harder to ignore, and the investigators logged it carefully, aware that each addition increased coherence while also increasing risk. Because coherence invites scrutiny. And scrutiny cuts both ways. At the prosecutor's office, discussions resumed in guarded tones, not about if, but about when, not about whether the case could be brought, but whether it should, because the law does not reward moral certainty, it demands legal sufficiency, and the gap between the two is where cases like this go to die. Still, something had shifted irreversibly. The case no longer felt stalled. It felt compressed. Like a spring held too long. The man sensed it. He stopped granting interviews entirely. He stopped attending events. He watched. Waited. And though no formal action followed, those close to him noticed the change, the way his patience thinned, the way he spoke in hypotheticals more often than before, the way the past, once dismissed as irrelevant, began to intrude into conversations unprompted. The past does not knock. It leaks. Florida 2001 remains unsolved. That is the official truth. But unofficially, in offices lit by desk lamps long after midnight, among people who have learned to live with uncertainty without surrendering to it, the case exists in a different state, not cold, not active, but awake. Watching. Waiting. Because some stories do not end when the evidence runs out. They end when someone finally decides they can no longer carry what they know alone. And until that moment arrives, the road remains just a road, the file remains open, and the question that started everything still hangs in the air, unanswered, unyielding. What really happened that night? And who has been living with the answer ever since? There is a point in every long investigation where the work becomes less about discovery and more about endurance, a quiet test of who can remain present the longest without flinching, and by the time the case reached this stage, everyone involved understood they were no longer chasing a revelation, they were waiting for erosion. Pressure had done its job. Not explosively. Gradually. The kind that reshaped stone without ever announcing itself as force. The cold case unit began operating under an unspoken assumption that the truth, whatever its final shape, would not arrive dramatically, not through a confession or a single piece of forensic brilliance, but through fatigue, through the slow wearing down of carefully constructed distance. The man at the center of attention continued to live inside that pressure, his world narrowing in ways only those under sustained scrutiny truly understand, friends becoming cautious, conversations guarded, routines stripped of spontaneity, and though no charge had been filed, no accusation formalized, his name had acquired gravity. People spoke it more carefully. Or not at all. Investigators noticed the change in his behavior not through surveillance, but through absence, the places he stopped going, the people he no longer contacted, the routes he avoided without explanation, and these adjustments, though not incriminating, were telling. Avoidance is a language. It just doesn't translate cleanly into court. Inside the task force, attention shifted again, not outward, but inward, toward the integrity of the case itself, every assumption re-examined, every inference challenged, because the closer they came to acting, the more dangerous certainty became. One misstep would not simply weaken their position. It would end the story permanently. They reconstructed the timeline yet again, minute by minute, stripping away narrative, focusing only on what could be anchored, and what remained was stark, a narrow window of opportunity, a sequence of movements that left no room for coincidence. Someone had been there. Someone who knew the area. Someone who understood how quickly normalcy could return. That understanding, more than any single fact, haunted the room. Emily's family sensed the shift even without updates. The way investigators spoke more slowly now, more deliberately, as if each word carried weight beyond its sound, and though they never asked for reassurance, they recognized the posture of people standing near a precipice. Hope becomes quieter at that edge. More careful. Public interest waned again, attention drifting toward newer mysteries, but among those who had followed the case closely, a different tone emerged, less speculation, more patience, as if the audience itself had learned that some truths demand silence before they surface. Then, without warning, a small fracture appeared. Not in evidence. In routine. The man missed an obligation, a minor, easily overlooked commitment, but one that disrupted a pattern he had maintained meticulously for years, and when asked about it later, his explanation arrived too quickly, too polished, the kind of answer prepared in advance. Prepared answers imply anticipated questions. Investigators noted it, not as proof, but as signal, another micro-adjustment in his system under strain. At the same time, an unrelated inquiry intersected the case unexpectedly. A financial review triggered by an entirely different matter uncovered discrepancies that did not align with the man's stated history during the years following Emily's disappearance. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just inconsistencies. Gaps. Periods of unexplained stability and unexplained movement. On their own, meaningless. In context, unsettling. The net did not tighten visibly. It narrowed psychologically. And that narrowing had consequences. People who had remained silent for years began to test the edges of disclosure, not coming forward formally, but asking questions, reaching out indirectly, probing for what investigators knew, what they could prove, what they suspected. These inquiries were cautious. Anonymous. But they were new. Silence, once absolute, had begun to crack. Late one evening, an investigator returned to the earliest interviews, listening not for content, but for cadence, for the rhythm of voices speaking about events they did not yet understand, and in one recording, barely noticeable before, a phrase landed differently. A correction. Unprompted. A witness adjusting a detail no one had challenged. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, paired with everything else, it suggested awareness. Awareness of scrutiny. Awareness of stakes. The realization spread slowly, the kind that does not cause celebration, only a deeper quiet, because awareness implies consciousness, and consciousness implies choice. And choices, once acknowledged, demand accountability. The case had not advanced on paper. No announcements were made. No warrants issued. But inside the rooms where it lived, the atmosphere changed. They were no longer waiting for the past to speak. They were watching the present react. Because when the truth draws near, it does not arrive loudly. It disturbs behavior. And somewhere, someone was feeling that disturbance acutely, adjusting, recalibrating, holding something heavy just a little less steadily than before. The question was no longer whether the case would end. It was how. And who would break first? Silence, once it settles into a case like this, stops being empty and starts becoming directional, pointing not toward what is missing, but toward who is listening, and by now, everyone involved could feel that silence had shifted its weight. Investigators stopped asking new questions. They began repeating old ones. Not out of confusion, but out of strategy, watching how answers aged, how confidence eroded, how people responded when they realized the past was no longer safely behind them, and in those repetitions, differences emerged, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle recalibrations, phrasing adjusted, emphasis moved, certainty softened. Memory does not usually change direction on its own. It changes under pressure. The man felt it most acutely in the small moments, a knock that arrived later than expected, a conversation that lingered one sentence too long, the sense that ordinary interactions were no longer ordinary, that every exchange carried an unseen secondary audience. He slept less. Not from fear, but from calculation. Sleep loosens control. And control, once threatened, becomes a priority. Those closest to him noticed the strain, the way he scanned rooms unconsciously, the way he spoke in fragments when tired, the way old stories resurfaced without invitation, details drifting into conversation like debris from a submerged wreck. he began revisiting the past aloud. Not to confess. To rehearse. Rehearsal is a defense. It is also a risk. Within the task force, a decision crystallized, not to escalate publicly, but to wait, to let the psychological landscape continue shifting until someone moved without realizing they were being observed. Time, they knew, was no longer the enemy. Impatience was. They reopened contact with peripheral figures, not suspects, not witnesses in the formal sense, but people who had existed at the edges of the case, neighbors, acquaintances, individuals who had once been adjacent to events without understanding their significance. These conversations were casual. Almost friendly. And because of that, they were revealing. One person mentioned an old comment, a remark dismissed at the time as tasteless humor, now resurfacing with a different tone. Another recalled a moment of tension that had seemed personal rather than situational. A third admitted to a long-held suspicion they had never voiced because it felt disloyal. Loyalty ages poorly when silence begins to feel complicit. Each account was minor. None of them actionable. But together, they formed an emotional contour, a shape of unease that matched the case more closely than any single fact ever had. Emily's presence lingered through all of it, not as a victim, but as a disruption, the point where normal life had fractured, and though years had passed, that fracture still guided the way people remembered their own histories, where they had been, what they had said, what they had not said. Some began to realize they had been carrying pieces of the story without recognizing them as such. Recognition is rarely immediate. It arrives with discomfort. Then came the moment no one anticipated. Not a confession. Not a discovery. But a mistake. Small. Human. The man contradicted himself publicly, just slightly, during an offhand remark about the years following Emily's disappearance, nothing overt, nothing illegal, but the inconsistency landed hard with those who knew the file, because it disrupted a timeline he had adhered to meticulously for decades. The correction followed quickly. Too quickly. The internet noticed. Investigators noticed more. They did not respond. They did not clarify. They let the moment exist, unaddressed, knowing that unresolved inconsistencies behave like splinters, drawing attention precisely because they are small. From that point on, everything accelerated internally, while remaining invisible externally. Subpoenas drafted but not served, motions prepared but not filed, a case built in negative space, defined as much by what it refused to reveal as by what it contained. The pressure intensified. The man's circle thinned. Those who remained grew cautious. And somewhere between isolation and awareness, something shifted in his posture, a subtle surrender of inevitability, not guilt, but acceptance that the story was no longer fully his to control. Late one night, an investigator wrote a single sentence in the margin of a working document. He knows we're close. No evidence supported the statement. No metric confirmed it. But everyone who read it understood. Because closeness, at this stage, was no longer about facts. It was about behavior. About anticipation. About the way people move when they believe the ground beneath them is no longer stable. Florida 2001 still had no ending. No resolution. But the silence around it had become too deliberate to ignore. Something was being held back. Not by the system. By a person. And as the days narrowed into something taut and expectant, one truth became unavoidable. When that silence finally broke, it would not sound like relief. It would sound like collapse.